My son called me on a Tuesday morning in late September, and for just a second, when I saw his name on the screen, I smiled. Daniel, my boy, 34 years old and still, somehow, the first thing I think of when I see his name is a 7-year-old with grass stains on his knees chasing fireflies in the backyard. I answered on the second ring. He didn't say, hello. The first words out of his mouth were, Dad, we need you to transfer the cabin to us before the partnership ceremony. If you don't, Kristen's family won't take the arrangement seriously, and the whole deal falls apart. I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at the window above the sink. Outside, the oak tree in the backyard was just beginning to turn, gold at the edges, still green in the middle. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, Good morning to you too, son. He didn't laugh. I asked him to repeat what he'd said, not because I hadn't heard it, but because I needed a few extra seconds to make sure I was understanding him correctly. He repeated it, word for word, same tone. A cabin that had been in my family for 3 generations, the one my father built with his own hands on a lake in northern Minnesota, the one where Daniel himself learned to fish and swim and ride a bike on the gravel path along the water, was now a bargaining chip in a business arrangement with his girlfriend's family. I told him I'd call him back. I set the phone face down on the counter and stood there looking out at that oak tree for a long time. Her name was Kristen Farwell. She came into Daniel's life about 2.5 years before that phone call. She was polished, educated, worked in commercial real estate, always arrived at family dinners with a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. At first, I liked her. She was sharp, and she made Daniel sharper. He dressed better, spoke more carefully, seemed to carry himself with more confidence. I took those things as good signs. Then the questions started. Not from Daniel, from Kristen. Small questions, asked casually, as if she were just making conversation. What did I pay for the cabin originally? Was the dock permitted? What did properties on that lake typically sell for? Had I thought about whether it made more sense to liquidate something like that rather than let it sit idle most of the year? I answered politely the first few times. Then I started changing the subject. Daniel never seemed to notice the pattern. Or maybe he noticed and didn't think it was worth mentioning. Either way, the questions kept surfacing. And gradually, like water finding cracks in old concrete, they started showing up in Daniel's own mouth. Dad, have you thought about what you're going to do with the cabin long term? Dad, you're not getting up there as much as you used to. Dad, it doesn't make a lot of sense to sit on a depreciating asset. Depreciating asset. My father built that cabin with lumber he cut himself. He poured the foundation over 2 summers while working a full-time job. My parents spent every August up there for 40 years. When my wife Carol was sick, that cabin was the one place she said made her feel like herself again. We scattered some of her ashes off the dock, and now it was a depreciating asset. I let it go. Because that's what fathers do. We let things go. But that Tuesday morning phone call was different. That wasn't a question. That wasn't a gentle suggestion wrapped in concern. That was a condition. Transfer the cabin or watch the business deal collapse. As if my family's land was a transaction fee. I didn't call Daniel back that afternoon. I needed to think first. And thinking clearly has always required me to talk to someone who tells me the truth even when I don't want to hear it. That person is my old friend Ray Hutchins, a retired contracts attorney I've known since we coached Little League together when our boys were 9 years old. Ray lost his wife 2 years before I lost Carol. We've been getting breakfast at the same diner every other Thursday since then. Between the two of us, we've probably figured out most of life's bigger problems over eggs and bad coffee. I called Ray and he told me to come over. He read the text messages Daniel had sent following up on the call, because of course Daniel had followed up with texts. His tone in writing was different than his voice, more formal, more like he was outlining terms. Ray read through them slowly, the way he used to read contracts, looking for the sentence underneath the sentence. How long has she been working on him? Ray asked. 2.5 years at least, I said. And how long has he been talking about the cabin like it's yours to give away? I thought about it. About a year. Ray handed the phone back to me. Robert, he said, and he's called me Robert since 1987. Regardless of what anyone else calls me, you know what this is. I know what it looks like. It looks exactly like what it is. We sat with that for a minute. Then Ray asked a question that landed harder than I expected. He said, How many times has Daniel come to you for money since Carol died? I looked out his living room window. The yard was overgrown. Ray had never been much for lawn care, even when Margaret was alive to remind him. I didn't answer right away. That's not a judgment, Ray said. I did the same thing with my son. 4 times, I said. Maybe 5. Big amounts? Big enough. Ray nodded slowly. He said, there's a difference between helping someone you love and insulating them from consequences. Sometimes those two things feel identical from the inside. I didn't respond because he was right and we both knew it. Before I left, Ray asked me one more thing. He asked if I'd ever told Daniel about what I'd done with the cabin 2 years ago. I told him no. He asked me why. And I told him the same thing I'm going to tell you, because it was never supposed to matter. What Ray was referring to goes back almost 2 years, to the winter after Carol died. I was 61 years old, sitting in a house that felt 3 times bigger than it needed to be, going through her things and thinking about what she would have wanted to leave behind. Carol wasn't a complicated person about money. She believed in 2 things, taking care of your people and not wasting what you've been given. But she also believed deeply in the idea that some things shouldn't be inherited, that some things should be passed forward to people who never had the luck you had. We'd had long conversations about this during her last year, when she was clearer about her wishes than she'd ever been in her healthy years. People tend to get honest when time stops feeling infinite. After she died, I spent about 8 months just getting through each day. Then I spent another 8 months thinking. Then I made a decision. I consulted an estate attorney named Patricia Voss, who was thorough and patient and didn't try to rush me into anything. Together, we established an irrevocable conservation and community trust. The cabin, the land, and the dock. All of it was transferred into that trust. The purpose was twofold. First, to preserve the land from development in perpetuity, which was something Carol had felt strongly about. And second, to fund a rotating residency program for veterans and their families who could apply to stay at the cabin during designated weeks throughout the year at no cost. The paperwork was finalized on a February afternoon that was so cold the windows in Patricia's office were frosted at the edges. The cabin was no longer mine to give. It had never been mine to give since that day. It belonged to something larger than any of us. Daniel didn't know. There was no reason to tell him. The cabin wasn't going anywhere. I still used it. He was still welcome to use it. The legal structure underneath it was simply none of his business because, and I want to be clear about this, I never imagined for a single moment that my son would one day call me and demand I hand it over as a condition of his business dealings. Some things you don't expect from your own children. You just don't. That evening, I drove past the cabin on Google Maps the way I sometimes do when I need to feel grounded. I know that sounds strange, but when you can't physically be somewhere, sometimes just looking at the satellite image of the tree line helps. I could see the dock from above. I could see the bend in the shoreline where Daniel used to set up his fishing pole when he was 12 years old, convinced the big ones hid in the shadow of the old fallen elm. I also did something else that evening that I wish I hadn't done, but I'm glad I did. I went to return a call to my sister in Phoenix, and while I was scrolling through my recent messages, I accidentally opened a voice memo that had synced to my phone from a shared family tablet. I didn't know Daniel still used that tablet when he visited. Apparently he did. The memo was Daniel's voice, but it wasn't a message to me. It sounded like he was thinking out loud, or maybe recording notes for himself. It ran about 4 minutes. I almost stopped it after 10 seconds. I didn't. He walked through what he called the asset situation. He talked about the cabin's estimated current market value, a number that was accurate, which meant someone had recently looked it up. He talked about how a transfer of the property to a family LLC would position Kristen's family favorably and demonstrate that the partnership was backed by tangible equity. He talked about timelines. He talked about how to have the conversation with me in a way that would be most likely to land. Most likely to land. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that memo ended. The overhead light hummed. The refrigerator cycled on and off. On the windowsill was a small clay pot Carol had made in a ceramics class the year before she got sick. She'd been so proud of it. It was lopsided and the glaze had bubbled slightly on one side, and she thought it was perfect. I thought it was perfect too. I looked at that pot and said out loud to no one, I don't know when I stopped being his father and started being a line item. I went to bed that night knowing the situation was worse than I'd allowed myself to believe. And I went to bed knowing that whatever happened next, I was not going to let someone else's plan for my family's land become the thing that finished us. In the days that followed, I became briefly popular with relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Daniel had clearly been making calls, because suddenly I was receiving them. His aunt on Carol's side called to talk about not letting pride get in the way. A cousin I hadn't spoken to since a funeral 12 years ago left a voicemail about the importance of family unity. Even an old neighbor from our previous neighborhood called to say Daniel had reached out to him and he just wanted me to think about what was really important here. Everyone seemed to believe that I was being stubborn about just a cabin. Just a cabin. My father's hands built that cabin. My mother spent her summers there. Carol took her last deep breath of lake air on that dock. There is no such thing as just anything when it belongs to the dead as much as the living. I stopped returning calls. The peace it brought was immediate. About a week after the original phone call, I was splitting firewood in the backyard, something I still do even though I don't strictly need to, because it clears my head the way nothing else does when Daniel's car came up the driveway. Alone. No, Kristen. My heart did something involuntary when I saw him. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a parent. Your children can hurt you in ways that would level anyone else, and your body still responds to seeing them the same way it always has. I set down the maul and walked toward him. He looked tired, red around the eyes. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and was looking at the ground when he climbed out of the car. We went inside. I made coffee. Neither of us spoke for a while, which was unusual. Daniel had always been a talker, even as a kid. He could fill any silence. This silence he couldn't fill. Eventually he looked up and said, "I'm sorry for how I said it." I nodded. "Okay." He looked back at his cup. "But I'm not sorry for asking." I nodded again. "I know." He launched into an explanation then. He talked about the business opportunity and how significant it was, how Kristen's family had connections that could change their trajectory, how this was the moment they'd been building toward, how he'd never ask for something like this if it weren't truly important. He talked for a long time, and as he talked, I found myself looking at him the way you sometimes look at someone you love when you're trying to reconcile the person in front of you with the person you remember. I kept seeing the 12-year-old on the dock. The teenager who stayed up with me the night we thought Carol's surgery had gone wrong, sitting in the hospital waiting room playing cards because neither of us could sleep. The young man who gave a eulogy at his mother's funeral that made 300 people cry and made me simultaneously the saddest and proudest I have ever been in my life. Where does that person go? He doesn't go anywhere, I think. He just gets buried sometimes. Under pressure, under influence, under the slow accumulation of someone else's priorities. Daniel reached across the table. "Dad, if you just do this one thing—" "No, son." He blinked. I said no. His jaw tightened. For a second, I saw something flash across his face that wasn't quite anger, but was adjacent to it. Then it softened into something that looked more like confusion. Like he genuinely could not figure out what kind of father would say no to his child in a moment like this. That look told me more than the voice memo had. He left an hour later. We didn't argue. We didn't shout. We just ran out of things to say that weren't going to make it worse. I stood on the porch and watched his car back down the driveway and disappear around the corner. Then I went inside and sat in Carol's reading chair and stayed there until it got dark. The partnership ceremony was held on a Saturday in October at a venue outside of St. Paul, a converted warehouse space, industrial chic, Edison bulbs, and exposed brick, catered, open bar. 40 or 50 people there to celebrate the launch of whatever business entity Daniel and Kristen and her family were formalizing. I almost didn't go. Ray told me not to. My sister told me to. I split the difference and decided to go, but arrive late and leave early and make no promises about how long I'd stay. When I walked in, the room did that thing rooms do when the person everyone has been discussing walks through the door. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted slightly, the way air pressure changes before a storm. Daniel spotted me immediately. He crossed the room and shook my hand. His grip was firm and professional, the way you shake hands with someone you're trying to impress rather than someone you grew up calling daddy. Kristen appeared a moment later. She smiled at me with the kind of smile that operates independently of the eyes. "Gerald, so glad you could make it. My name is Gerald." She had called me that correctly every single time for 2.5 years. And still, every time she said it, something about the way she said it made me feel like a stranger. The evening moved slowly. I found a corner and stayed in it mostly, watching. I watched how Daniel moved through the room, confident, assured, slightly performing. I watched how Kristen's family talked amongst themselves, the way they glanced at Daniel and then at each other with the look of people who have made a calculation and are satisfied with it. I watched Kristen herself and I noticed something I hadn't registered clearly before. She never touched Daniel out of tenderness. She touched him out of curation, a hand on his arm to redirect him, a touch at his back to position him, everything deliberate, nothing spontaneous. At some point I stepped outside for air. The parking lot was lit orange by the overhead floods. The October air was cold enough that my breath showed. I was standing there alone when I heard voices from around the corner of the building. A sliding door had been propped open a few feet away. I recognized Kristen's voice first. She was talking to who I assumed was her father based on the tone. I wasn't trying to listen. I just didn't move fast enough to not hear. She said, "He'll come around. He doesn't have anyone to leave it to otherwise." Her father said something I couldn't fully make out. She said, "It doesn't matter what he does with it in the meantime. As long as we're the eventual beneficiaries, the bank will honor the equity as collateral." A pause. Her father, "Does Daniel know the full picture?" Kristen, "Daniel knows what he needs to know." I walked back to my truck. I sat behind the wheel for a while with the engine off, looking at the lit windows of the building. Inside, people laughed. Someone raised a glass. A phone camera flashed. 40 feet away, my son was celebrating his future without knowing that the woman he was celebrating it with had already decided what his father was worth and when she expected to collect. I started the truck and drove home. The formal gathering they'd planned for the following weekend was originally conceived as a family dinner, a smaller, quieter event where the two families would sit down together and where, I had been informed through Daniel, they expected me to bring the documentation showing I was moving forward on the cabin. I brought documentation, just not the kind they were expecting. I arrived to find Daniel, Kristen, and her parents already seated at the private dining room they'd reserved at a restaurant in downtown Minneapolis. The table was set formally, water glasses already filled. The mood was structured, deliberate, designed to make negotiation feel like dinner. Daniel stood when I came in. There was something in his eyes that I recognized from his childhood. The look he used to get when he wanted something very badly and had convinced himself he deserved it. We sat. Pleasantries passed like a formality. Then Kristen's father, a man named Douglas Farwell, who wore the kind of watch that is meant to be noticed, looked at me with the expression of a man closing a deal and said, "Gerald, we're glad you're here. I think we're all hoping to leave tonight with some clarity." I reached into my jacket and set an envelope on the table. Thick, sealed, addressed to no one. Daniel looked at it. His whole posture shifted. "Go ahead," I said. He opened it. I watched his face as he read. Page 1 took about 40 seconds. Somewhere in the middle of page 2, his expression shifted from anticipation to confusion. Page 3, he went still. Then he handed the papers to Kristen without a word. Her reaction was faster and sharper than his. She read quickly, professionally, the way people in real estate read documents. Then she set them down. Her face was controlled, but her eyes weren't. "What is this?" she said. "It's an irrevocable conservation trust," I said, "established almost 2 years ago. The cabin, the land, the dock, all of it was transferred at that time. It's been operating since then. Veterans and their families have stayed there on 8 separate occasions." Silence. Then Kristen said, very quietly, "You can't just undo this?" "No. That's what irrevocable means." Her father shifted in his chair. The watch caught the light. Daniel finally spoke. "You did this 2 years ago and never told me?" "I did." "Why?" I looked at my son. I said, "Because it wasn't supposed to matter." Something moved across Daniel's face. He looked down at the papers again. Then he looked up at Kristen. "Did you know something like this was possible?" She didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, something changed. "Kristen," he said, more carefully this time, "you told me the property was a guaranteed asset. You built the whole collateral structure around it." She said, "I built it around what you told me the situation was. What I told you based on what you asked me." Her father interjected, measured and smooth, but Daniel turned to him with an expression I had not seen on my son's face in years. It was not anger. It was clarity. The cold, arriving clarity of someone who has just understood a thing they should have understood much sooner. "How long have you been treating my father's property as a financial instrument?" Daniel said. His voice was low. It was Carol's voice when she was truly serious about something. Kristen said something about practicality, about planning, about how none of this would have mattered if the trust hadn't existed, and none of this was personal. "None of this is personal," Daniel repeated. Slowly, the room held that sentence for a long moment. Then Daniel stood up. He looked at her family. He looked at her. He said, "I think we need to stop here." Kristen stood too. "Daniel, this is not the time to... I'll be in touch with my lawyer about the partnership documents." He turned to me. "Dad, will you drive home with me?" I said yes. We left the documents on the table. We left the water glasses still full. We walked out through the restaurant past tables of people having normal dinners who didn't know that a family had just reassembled itself somewhere in the middle of all that noise. The weeks after that night were not easy. I want to be honest about that because these stories sometimes skip the hard part. Daniel didn't recover from the realization overnight. There were days he called me and we talked for an hour. There were days he didn't call at all. He was grieving something, not just a relationship, but a version of himself that had made certain choices and told himself certain stories about why those choices were fine. That kind of reckoning takes time. We did something that October I hadn't expected. We went up to the cabin together for a long weekend. We'd been up there together plenty over the years, but this felt different. Quieter, more deliberate. The first morning, we got up early and fished off the dock the way we used to when he was 12. Didn't catch much. Didn't matter. At some point, Daniel said, without looking up from the water, "I heard her voice in those conversations, you know." After a while, I stopped hearing mine. I didn't say anything right away. There are moments when saying nothing is the most generous thing you can offer someone. After a while, I said, "You know what your mother used to say about that?" He shook his head. "She said the surest sign you're in the wrong situation is when you can't remember what you actually think anymore." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I think I forgot what I actually thought for about a year and a half." A loon called from somewhere across the water. The morning was cold and gray, and one of the most peaceful I can remember. A few weeks later, Daniel went to the nonprofit that administers the cabin residency program and asked if they needed volunteers for any of the maintenance weeks. They said yes. He spent 2 weekends that November helping winterize the property, cleaning gutters, stacking wood, checking the pipes. He didn't tell me until after. He didn't do it for me to know. One afternoon, about 2 months after the dinner in Minneapolis, he called me on a Sunday morning, no particular reason, just to talk, the way we used to talk before all of it. We talked for almost an hour, about football, about the cabin, about what he was thinking about doing with his career now that the partnership had dissolved. He sounded like himself, not the version of himself I'd been watching from a distance for the past 2.5 years. The original version, underneath everything, still there. Near the end of the call, he said, "I owe you an apology, Dad, a real one." I said, "You already gave me one. I gave you an explanation. That's not the same thing." He was right. It wasn't the same thing. "I put something ahead of you that had no business being ahead of you," he said. "And I told myself it was practical. But I think I was just scared, and she was very good at making fear sound like ambition." I held the phone for a second. Outside, the oak tree was bare now. All the gold was gone, but the branches were clean against the pale November sky, and something about that looked right to me. "You know what I kept thinking about through all of this?" I said. "What?" "The night you gave the eulogy for your mother, 300 people in that room, and you stood up there and told the truth about who she was. No performance, just the truth." I paused. "That's who you are when no one's working on you." He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was a little rough around the edges. "I'm going to try to be that person more consistently," he said. "I know," I said. "You always do." After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. Carol's ceramic pot was still on the windowsill. Lopsided, bubbled glaze, imperfect. I'd never moved it. Never would. I thought about what the past several months had cost us both, and what we'd each gotten back on the other side of it. The cabin is still there. The dock still stands. Every summer, families who have sacrificed more than I can imagine arrive on that gravel road and spend a week in the place my father built. and breathe that lake air and maybe feel something like whole again. Carol would have understood that. She did understand it before she died. And my son, my actual son, called me on a Sunday for no reason except that I was his father and he wanted to talk. I'll take that over any deed in the world. If you've ever had to hold a boundary with someone you love more than you have words for, you already know what I'm trying to say. Sometimes protecting something real means letting go of something that was already disappearing. Sometimes the only way to keep your family is to refuse to pretend it's fine when it isn't. Thank you for listening. Holding a boundary with someone you love isn't the same as pushing them away sometimes. It's the only honest invitation back to who they really are. Gerald didn't chase his son, didn't beg, didn't pretend. He simply refused to let a lie stand in place of a relationship. And because he held firm, Daniel found his own way home. The door you keep open with dignity is the one people actually walk through. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to entertain and to leave you with something warm, worth carrying into your day.